those of you in the room and also those of you watching us on C-SPAN. My name is Elisa Massimino. I'm the president and CEO of Human Rights First. And we're here to talk about a problem that has motivated a very broad coalition of organizations who believe that the United States should be doing all it can, both to protect itself from terrorism and to protect refugees who seek safety on our shores. Our immigration laws that target individuals who've engaged in or supported the commission of terrorist acts serve two very legitimate goals: exclude from the United States people who threaten our national security and to penalize people who've engaged in or supported acts of violence that are inherently wrongful and condemned under U.S. and international law. Both of those purposes are consistent with our nation's commitment to protect refugees who have fled political, religious, or other forms of persecution. Indeed, the 1951 Refugee Convention and its protocol, to which the United States is a party, explicitly exclude from protection people who have committed a range of serious crimes, including acts of terrorism. The Refugee Convention also allows a country to expel a refugee who poses a danger to its security or who's been convicted of a particularly serious crime in that country and constitutes a danger to the community. But today, despite some recent improvements in the law, co-sponsored by Senators Leahy and Kyle, and despite the hard work of many in the Obama administration, many legitimate refugees who pose no threat to the United States have had their applications for asylum or permanent residence or family reunification denied or delayed due to overly broad provisions of the U.S. immigration law that were intended to protect the United States against terrorism. At Human Rights First, the organization which I lead, we see the impact of these laws and policies up close every day. Our Refugee Protection Program provides pro bono representation to individuals fleeing political, religious, ethnic, or other forms of persecution who seek asylum protection in the United States. Our clients come from countries, very diverse countries, over 80 different countries, including Iran, Iraq, Burma, Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Congo, the DRC, Cote d'Ivoire, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and China. Refugees from each of these countries and many others have been unjustly affected by the terrorism bars. We've issued over the course of the last 4 or 5 years 2 reports on this subject, the first in 2006 and another last year in 2009. And through that process, thank you, we learned of many individual refugees who've been adversely impacted by these provisions. Today, you're going to hear about some of those refugees, and you'll hear about the details of the law and policies that prevents them from gaining the protection to which they're entitled. But I want to mention just a couple up front, just to give you an idea of the kinds of cases that we're talking about. For example, a Sri Lankan refugee who paid ransom to his kidnapper spent 2.5 years in immigration detention upon his arrival in the United States and then was forced to wear a humiliating electronic ankle bracelet for more than 2 years after his release from those jail-like conditions. In total, he spent over 5 years in immigration proceedings here in the United States, the majority of it after he had already been found to qualify for asylum as a refugee, but while he was waiting to receive a waiver from the material support bar for the money that he had paid to his captors to allow him to escape. Through those years, he's remained separated from his wife and family, even as conditions in his home country deteriorated dramatically. Another case of which we became aware during our research is an Ethiopian father of 5 who'd been living in the United States for 7 years and was granted asylum by the immigration court more than 4 years ago. He was jailed after the decision to grant him asylum. That decision was reversed based on a later Board of Immigration Appeals decision that applied the law's overly broad definition of Tier 3 terrorist organization, which you'll hear more about in a minute. The immigration judge, after reconsidering his case, found that this man, whose own political activities were peaceful, had suffered torture in Ethiopia, that he would face a probability of further torture if he were deported there, and that he was eligible for asylum, but for the material support bar. But there's no process in place to consider people in his situation for waivers of the material support bar if their cases are in this procedural posture in immigration court. This is a serious problem, and it has brought together a serious coalition of groups and individuals to tackle it. The groups that you see in front of you today, and I'll introduce them in a moment, the people and the groups they represent, we all signed a letter in October to President Obama urging him to address this issue and to ensure at least that the provisions of the current law are interpreted and implemented in such a way that individuals such as the two that I just described, refugees from Sri Lanka and Ethiopia, are able to get a timely protection that they deserve. Our panel today is incredibly diverse, as I said, and also quite knowledgeable about the details of the law and the implementation of the law that causes this tragic situation that we are trying desperately to fix. I want to introduce each of them very briefly, and then we're going to hear about 5 to 7 minutes comment from each of the panelists, and then we'll open it up to questions and discussion. We have first, to my left, Kevin Appleby, who's the Director of Public Affairs and Migration Policy at the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops. Next, we'll hear from Galen Carey, who is from the National Association of Evangelicals, representing 41 denominations. Barrett Duke will be next, Vice President for Public Policy and Research at the Southern Baptist Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, the Southern Baptist Church, which has 16 million members and represents 45,000 churches. Next, we'll hear, after Barrett, from Michael Horowitz, who's our host here today at the Hudson Institute. Michael served in the Reagan administration and also played a key role in getting the improvements to the law that I referenced, co-sponsored by Senators Kyle and Leahy in 2007. After Michael, we'll hear from Melanie Nezer, who's Senior Director for U.S. Policy and Advocacy at HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and is incredibly knowledgeable about the details of the law and their impact on real refugees. Finally, batting cleanup is Wendy Wright, President of the Concerned Women for America, the nation's largest public policy women's organization. So you've got a very broad perspective, as I said, and people who are devoting the energies and talents of their individual energies and talents and the power of their organizations to stand up for refugees who are unjustly affected by these laws. Kevin?
Thank you, Alyssa, and thank you to the Hudson Institute for having me today. I'm Kevin Appleby. I'm the Director of Migration Policy and Public Affairs at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. And let me first explain why the Catholic Church is concerned about this issue. First of all, it's because, especially an institutional issue, we're the largest resettler of refugees in the country. We bring in about 18 to 20,000 refugees into this country each year. We have overseas operations through Catholic Relief Services and the International Catholic Migration Commission that see these cases every day in the field and are often calling us to ask us to see what we can do to get individual refugees admitted who are barred by material support. So we have an institutional issue. And we also look at this as a justice issue. The Catholic Church and the Catholic bishops strongly support the government's role in protecting our country and defending our borders. But we think we can balance that goal with the goal of maintaining our leadership as an international leader in human rights and the protector of human rights, which has really been an inspiration to countries and individuals around the globe. I think we can do both. And that's why we're here today, to talk about how we can do both going forward. What I've been asked to do is maybe give you a quick summary of how we got here, what the history has been on this issue. And we all know that this decade has been really characterized by the 9/11 attacks. And a lot of the politics in this country has been geared toward responding to those attacks, at least in the national security realm. And this has impacted the refugee area as well. So immediately after those attacks, the USA Patriot Act was passed, which was an understandable response to the terrorist attacks that occurred in our country. But like bills that are passed like this, sometimes there's unintended consequences. And we believe that one of the unintended consequences was the expansion of the definition of what a terrorist organization is. they included another category called a Tier 3 organization. And it really expanded the number of groups that could be considered terrorist groups. And I'll quote what the definition is. It's a group of two or more individuals, whether organized or not, which engages in or has a subgroup which engages in terrorist activity. And we also already have a broad definition of terrorist activity in the INA, which was added to include not only the use of explosives or firearms, but also an other weapon or dangerous device, and with the intent, directly or indirectly, to affect the safety of one or more individuals or to damage property. Those are pretty broad definitions when you look at them on their face. And they were done with the intent of trying to protect our country, which is what we all want to do. But it has had an unintended consequence, and it does apply to even groups who are resistance movements around the world, who may even be pro-democracy resistance groups that our government has supported in the past or has supports currently. So we're looking at a situation where there are terrorist groups that are not have no harm intended toward the United States. In fact, they're fighting repressive governments, but because of this broad definition, they qualify as a terrorist organization. To compound matters, you have the material support provision, which of course bars anyone who provides material support knowingly to a terrorist organization. So as you expanded the terrorist definition, you expanded the involvement between refugees who are really seeking protection and these resistance groups, and it has excluded a large number of refugees going forward. In fact, it's barred thousands from resettlement, from asylum, from withholding of removal. It also has impacted cases for permanent residency, adjustment of status in this country, and also for family reunification. Now, Congress realized that they might have overreached in 2007 and passed some waivers that the administration could use, discretionary waivers that they could use in individual cases, and in some cases group waivers, and they've been used. I would think they've been used sparingly. Only about 10,000 exemptions have been awarded, and over 20,000 refugees are still being impacted by this, and 4,600 cases are on hold because of some belief that they could have been involved in terrorism. We believe, from the bishop's position, we believe there needs to be a statutory change to look at some of these provisions and their broad definition, and also the what conditions that a refugee or someone might have done to support a terrorist group. For example, if they have a gun to their head, sometimes they're not admitted because there's no duress exception. But we are a signatory to this letter, which tries to urge the administration to look at these waivers and use them more aggressively than they're doing. They've done a lot, but they need to do more to really look at these cases so that refugees who are bona fide refugees, who are persecuted, the ones that we should be protecting, are the ones that we're allowing to this country, so we can maintain the balance of protecting our national security, but also being a safe haven for people around the world. And that's where the bishops are coming from. I think we can achieve that working with the administration and Congress, try to make some of these changes and to try to implement the law that's been written. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin.
Good afternoon. My name is Galen Carey. I'm the Director of Government Affairs for the National Association of Evangelicals, which, as Lisa said, represents 41 evangelical denominations, as well as many Christian schools, colleges, universities, seminaries, missions, and other parachurch groups. Before joining the NAE, I spent 26 years working with World Relief, which is our humanitarian affiliate of the NAE, working both in source countries of refugees, such as areas undergoing civil wars, severe human rights abuses, and extreme poverty, as well as in first asylum countries and in some cases in refugee camps, and as well have been involved with World Relief's refugee resettlement work here in the United States and work with asylum seekers. Why do we care about this issue? We care because the people whose lives are being hurt and damaged by these wrong policies are people that we know and care about. While I was working in Mozambique some years ago, my wife was working in a refugee camp and met a Congolese boy who had fled the war and fighting there in Congo and come all the way to Mozambique walking, actually, as a refugee. He eventually became a part of our family, and we was informally adopted as our son, and now lives here in the United States. Fortunately, he was able to be accepted as a refugee, but many others in similar circumstances to his have not been accepted for the reasons which are discussed in the report and which we outline in this letter, which the NE is also a signer of. Many times people think that if you make it to a refugee camp that you're okay. It's a place of safety and refuge as you wait for a permanent solution. In fact, too often that is not the case. From my work in refugee camps, I'm aware of many, many cases of people who are raped and abused and robbed and many other things while in the refugee camps, supposedly under international protection. In one case, I visited with a pastor and his wife from Rwanda who were in a refugee camp in Mozambique. The wife had been receiving threats from some of the other refugees in the camp and asked to leave the camp, and actually they did leave the camp and somehow were able to survive with nothing, no support of any kind. But then the people in the refugee camp who were after her tracked her down and murdered her, leaving the pastor and his 5 children basically with nowhere to go. Too many times that's what happens, and too many times refugees are refused a permanent solution for many reasons. Sometimes it's matters of capacity, but in the cases we're discussing today, these are people who, in fact, have fled persecution. They're people seeking freedom. The United States is a country which is a beacon of hope and freedom around the world, but too often the laws which are meant to keep us safe actually do nothing to enhance our security and hurt other people. And in fact, from my experience of working in many countries, when the United States is not seen as a beacon of freedom and hope, that actually deteriorates our security. Meanwhile, all of the time which government officials spend on these waivers and very complicated maneuvers that have to be done to deal with cases which should be straightforward approvals, that's time that is not available to go after the real terrorists and do things that would help to make us safe. So for all those reasons, we strongly urge that the administration take appropriate action to streamline the processes, and that the cases of all of these people who are in hold can be finally resolved. Thank you.
Thank you, Galen. Barrett?
I'm Barrett Duke. I'm the Vice President for Public Policy and Research for the Southern Baptist Convention's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. As you heard, we have about 16 million members in the United States, worshiping in about 45,000 autonomous congregations. Hundreds of those congregations are currently engaged in refugee resettlement. They are currently looking for folks that they can assist to get settled into the United States and help them assimilate as well into their communities. Some of them are finding it very difficult to do that because these folks can't get the permanent legal status that they need to actually be able to really engage in life here and know that they're going to be able to stay. And it's becoming frustrating to a number of our congregations, and it certainly is to us at the Southern Baptist Convention as well. We supported the goals of the Real ID Act. We recognize that there are real terrorists who have real intentions of harming and killing Americans and others who support democracy and freedom. We recognize that, and we support the goals of keeping the terrorists out of the United States. But somehow those well-meaning goals have certainly been turned on their head when you consider some of the people being caught up in some of this this bureaucratic limbo that's going on right now. Just a few, you've got children who were abducted and forced to fight against others and rebel groups because they were forced against their will to participate in these activities. All of a sudden, they're being labeled as terrorists and not able to get the protections that this nation is supposed to be offering them. You have doctors who simply provided a humanitarian service all of a sudden being accused of being terrorists simply because they were fulfilling their responsibility to assist people who were hurt, who they possibly didn't even know were terrorists. You have groups who fought repressive governments, sometimes at the encouragement of the United States, all of a sudden finding themselves because they actually assisted the United States in its goals of democracy promotion and resisting tyrannical regimes, being themselves accused as being members of terrorist groups. We just think that this is outrageous, that this would be going on, and it's obviously the result of simply a bureaucracy that seems to have lost any idea what common sense is, and certainly has lost the ability to apply some level of compassion and concern about the folks who are being caught up in this bureaucratic limbo. Now, I've got lists, as we all have, of people here who have been affected by this. Here's a Burmese gentleman, been in the United States since 2008. He and his wife and son, and still he cannot get a permanent determination from the United States government on whether or not he's going to be deported or allowed to stay here. Here's a Burmese Karen man who came here from a refugee camp in 2008, still wondering if he's actually going to be able to stay. Here's an Ethiopian Oromo lady who came in 2000, and she's still trying to find out whether or not she's going to be able to stay. Here's an Eritrean refugee man who came here in 2005, still in the same situation. It's obvious that the administration is taking too long to sort out the details of exactly what kinds of questions need to be asked of these folks in order to help them, even give them the opportunity to present their case that they deserve to be allowed to remain in the United States permanently. Some of these folks are subject to deportation even before they get to argue their case before the appropriate person in the United States administration. We believe this has gone on too long, and it needs to be addressed immediately. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barrett. You really encapsulated the Alice in Wonderland sense of the situation that we're facing. Wendy?
Thank you. I'm Wendy Wright, president of Concerned Women for America, which is the nation's largest public policy women's organization. And we seek to impact public policy with biblical principles. And as Americans, we humbly believe that America is a great country. And one reason why America is great is the foundational principle expressed in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. God created each one of us and placed us in families. Knowing this helps us see the value in each human being and gives us a desire to care for those in need and their families. Christians are keenly aware of the inhumane persecution against unfavored people around the world. We pray for and we bring relief in a variety of ways to the disadvantaged and persecuted throughout the world. Americans are incredibly generous to the needy. And just look at the outpouring of aid whenever and wherever disaster strikes. This generosity extends to providing a place of refuge to rescue people from violent persecution or death. Many of us are particularly sensitive to the plight of unmarried women refugees who are especially vulnerable to exploitation before they can make it to our shores. And Americans recognize that no man is an island. Our laws provide for these refugees' immediate family members, their spouses and unmarried children under age 21, to share in that refuge. That's because Americans recognize how critical families are for us to thrive as human beings. Our policies should not result in breaking up families. Yet the bureaucratic limbo that these refugees experience impact their families. In some cases, their spouse and underage children are also left in limbo, unable to join them in America, while they are restricted from traveling overseas to be with their family. One mother from Cameroon was granted asylum based on her peaceful political activism with the rights of Cameroon's English-speaking minority. Her petition to bring her children to join her here in the U.S. was placed on hold based on DHS's determination that the Southern Cameroon's National Council should be considered a Tier 3 group. By the time DHS indicated it was reconsidering its assessment of the group, one of her children had died of illness. For some, the wait is so long that their child ages past 21 years old. Then it's too late to be reunited through these channels. In the regions of the world from which these refugees are fleeing, for a wife or underage child to be separated from their husband or father places them at great risk, not only of deprivation, but of being attacked by their husbands or father's persecutors. Women and girls are especially vulnerable to rape and exploitation. But it's not only compassionate to finalize the status of these refugees and allow their families to be reunited with them. It's good for America to keep families intact. Men who are married are healthier, enjoy more stable employment, receive higher performance ratings and faster promotions, and are less likely to be victims of violent crime. Women who are married are less likely to end up in poverty, less likely to be victims of violent or sexual assault, and more emotionally healthy. Communities with higher percentages of people living in healthy marriages have higher rates of physically healthy citizens, higher rates of emotionally healthy citizens, higher rates of educated citizens, lower crime statistics, and a decreased need for social services. Concerned Women for America is thankful for the many people in our country who are extending help and hope to refugees. We just need the bureaucracy to come in line with congressional intent to make our intentions a reality. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Wendy. Michael.
Let me try and put it into perspective. The issue is not whether we should or should not let people in. These rules here have nothing, do not automatically admit anyone. The sole issue is whether we give people the chance to prove that they have a legitimate fear of persecution where they are, and to prove under the highest possible standards that they are not terrorists and pose no terrorist threat to the United States. That's the issue. The law, which we changed 3 years ago, and which this administration is just sitting on its hands about, gave leeway to stop the business of guilt by association. Oh, you gave some food to some group which was affiliated with some group that may have had military resistance to a persecuting regime, therefore you're a terrorist. Everybody knew, as Barrett says, that defied common sense. And we had conservatives and liberals join together to give waiver authority, to tell the administration, stop defining these groups, stop creating this blacklist that says anybody who touches it is defined as a terrorist and his family is defined as a terrorist. And what has the administration done? They've sat on their hands and they've just let the size of this so-called Tier 3 group grow and grow and grow and done nothing about it. The issue, therefore, is not only protecting refugees. The issue is the rule of law, following the intention of Congress. And again, I want to say, as somebody who's pretty hardcore on this issue, it only involves allowing people to prove under the toughest possible standards that they will be persecuted in their home countries and that they pose no threat to the United States. Now, some examples. As some have mentioned, a gun got stuck to somebody's head, and he is then forced to join a military operation or to wash clothes of her rapist. Before we amended the law 3 years ago, those people were defined as terrorists. Congress came along and said, for God's sake, stop it. Act sensibly. This administration, for the most part, has not done it. It's done it a little bit in some cases, but in most cases, it has not done so. And then you come to the ultimate, this so-called Tier 3 listing. You've heard the definition. Any group which is affiliated with some other group which may have used a weapon in some context, maybe 20 years ago, is a group which, if you have any tie to, blacklists you and your family, doesn't allow your family to prove that you're not a threat to the United States. In fact, many people in the United States proved that they were not threats to the United States. Then this law was passed in the, as Kevin says, and then a new interpretation came and said, gee, we let you in. Yes, you would be persecuted if you're in your home country. Yes, you pose no terrorist threat whatsoever to the United States. Yes, you've lived here for a long time and you've been perfectly fine, but now you're a terrorist and now your family's a terrorist. The administration's got 80 or 90 of these groups. They've sat on their hands. This blacklisting process has continued. We're not talking about floodgates. We're not talking about large numbers of people. This letter that was sent on October 8th to the president has gotten no attention. I should say, and let me amend that. Let me amend that with thanks to C-SPAN, the great C-SPAN, because my impression is that since the administration realized that this panel was here, that C-SPAN would broadcast these facts to the American people, suddenly calls are being made by the administration to some of the people at this desk say, well, we'll sit down with you. We're about to make this reform. We're on the verge of doing that. So I say to everybody in this room, everybody on this panel, let's keep the heat on. We kept it on the Bush administration. Let's keep it on the Obama administration. This is a season when this administration ought to get off its duff and understand the importance of family, the importance of justice, the importance of protecting us against real terrorists, and the importance of the rule of law. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Melanie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Melanie Nezer. I'm the policy director for the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. And my job is to kind of explain to you why now. Why are we talking about this now? I think you've heard why and how we got here, but why are we here to talk about this now? First of all, it's the holiday season, and we've spent way too many holiday seasons now dealing with this problem. It's time for the administration to fix it, and I want to say that I do see some people here from the administration, from the agencies, from Capitol Hill, and from many organizations that have really worked tirelessly to try to resolve these issues. But for some reason, we just can't get this over the finish line, and now's the time to do that. So yes, families are separated. It's another holiday season. It's time to get this done. The other thing is, it shouldn't take years to decide that someone who is already in the U.S., who has already been given legal status by the U.S. government, who is already determined to be a refugee by the U.S. government, who has already gone through more background checks and security screening than any other type of immigrant in this country, whether that person is a security threat or not. It shouldn't be taking this long. If someone's really a security threat, we should be making those decisions quickly. If it's a group, if it's somebody who's in one of these groups who has been admitted as a refugee, who has been here peacefully working, raising families, then let's just decide their case, give them their green card, allow them to bring their families in and move on. It's time to just get that done. These are people who, by definition, as refugees, have already survived great uncertainty and loss. It's not an understatement to say that this issue has really affected communities and actually the psychology of refugees here. Ethiopians, Sudanese, Burmese, they know what this label means. They know that they've been called terrorists. What do you think that does to communities and individuals who have escaped persecution, and many of whom have either fought back or were forced to do things that they didn't want to do? It's really created this kind of culture of uncertainty, and when you talk to people here, the kind of, I don't want to say betrayal because they're so grateful to be here, but the confusion about why am I being called a terrorist now? I've already been offered protection here. So it just needs to end. We are celebrating the 60th anniversary of the the UN Refugee Convention, which was enacted as the international response to Nazi genocide in 1951. And I just want to talk about one more case. We've talked about a bunch of cases. This goes back in history, and it kind of illustrates why this is so fundamental to us as a country, and as a Jewish organization, why this is so fundamental to us as a people. And when this problem first started surfacing, I actually contacted our archivist in New York, And I said, I'm wondering if you could just pull up any cases where people that we've resettled over our 130-year history might have been barred under these laws. And he got back to me in about 10 minutes and he said, well, how many cases do you need? And I said, well, give me one. So one of the cases he came up with, and I'm going to read from this book that was written about this particular family. The book is called Defiance by Nakama Tech, and it's about the Belsky family. There was actually a movie made about them. And some of the members of this family were resettled by Hayes after the war. And so what the author says is in 1906, Tuvia Belsky was born into a Jewish family of farmers in eastern Poland. Theirs was the typical life of peasants struggling to get by and building a family, but all that changed when the Russian occupation of Poland and later the German advancement came into Poland. When the Nazis began mass executions of Jews in 1941, slaughtering Belsky's parents and other relatives in the Jewish ghetto, Tuvia Belsky fled to the nearby forest with his 3 brothers. What began as a gathering of family developed into a well-organized partisan unit. Hundreds of Jews who escaped the mass killings and deportations joined up and participated in countless acts of resistance and rescue. From the depths of the forest, they staged raids on Germans, Belarusian police, and local farmers who had collaborated with the Nazis. So after the war, 1,230 people came out of that forest. Men, women, children, elderly. And this was all thanks to their leader and the resistance and the fact that they put up a fight. They all survived. And what we're talking about today is really no different. In Ethiopia, in Sudan, in Burma, this is who we're talking about. People who are rising up against the most oppressive regimes, who are trying to fight back. And we have got them caught up in this system where we're labeling them terrorists. And granted, as all of us on this panel are extremely concerned about security, that is not the issue here. The issue here is to finally resolve this problem and let these people get on with their lives.
Thank you, Melanie. I'm going to stand up here and call on people for questions. And there's a big pillar here right on my right. So if you're behind it and you want to ask a question, kind of peek out and make yourself heard. But I just wanted to reiterate, on that last point, Melanie, we have a lot of complicated immigration challenges in our country today, and there's a lot of discussion about them and public debate. But this should not be one of them. This is not complicated. We have a policy that's currently being implemented in a way that, participants in the Warsaw Uprising would have been designated as a terrorist organization and barred from refugee status. That is not a complicated problem. We need to solve it. We have worked very hard with concerned people inside the administration who understand this problem and agree with us. But there needs to be leadership from the top on this. It has to be a priority. And that's why we wrote to the president in October. And we are hoping very much to hear a declaration of leadership on this from the top very soon. I also want to reiterate that next year is the 60th anniversary of the Refugee Convention. And in many ways, the people who are caught up in this policy are the ones that the Refugee Convention was motivated to help. So it would be a very appropriate moment for the United States to reassert its leadership, as it did in helping to draft the Refugee Convention nearly 60 years ago. So I think we would like to start with any questions that we might have from the members of the media, either on the phone or in the room. Feel free to direct your question to any of the panelists in particular. If you don't do that, they will volunteer or be called on by me to answer the question. Who wants to start? Anybody on the phone? I think that you have. Do people know how? Do we have anybody on the phone right now? *6 will allow you to talk. Okay, we've convinced every single person in this room, and we can all go home. Anybody have any questions? Okay, way in the back.
I'm going to do this just because you need a question.
Oh, well, thank you.
I've heard you describe the problems, and it's all very poignant. I would like to hear you describe the solution. What specific changes do you want to see made, either in the law or in the relevant regulations, which would make life easier for the, quote, good, unquote, refugees who are having problems?
Michael, and then
Well,
Melanie.
first in the regulations, you've got these, again, the real binder is this so-called Tier 3 listing, which makes you a terrorist group, and therefore, if you had any association with it, makes you a terrorist. If that organization or any affiliated organization, no matter how long ago, ever fired a weapon, does it matter if it's in self-defense? No. Does it matter on the side of the United States? No. The first step is clear up the backlog of the 80, 100, whatever the number of groups are, so that the administration can then keep ahead of the curve as it is defining these groups. The second is tell these groups when a group is defined as a Tier 3 group. I've talked to some of the leaders of the immigration groups. I've said, how many Tier 3 groups are there? They don't know. What's the list of the Tier 3 groups? They don't know. So I think there needs to be a time limit. If the administration defines a group as a Tier 3 group, it's really defining it as a terrorist group. Just because somebody associated with the group pulled a trigger however many years ago, the administration should, within a 45-day period, make a determination one way or the other permanently if that is such a group. And then when there are waivers sought on grounds of duress, gun to the head, once again, there ought to be a time period. Maybe you can give some extreme exceptions, but these cases need to be processed quickly, which the administration has not done. So I think that can be done administratively.
I can add to that. Melanie, do you have something you'd like to say? I mean, just to underscore, while it's true what Michael says that we can't catalog the whole list of Tier 3 groups, some of the groups that we know are excluded under this Tier 3 designation are all Iraqis and Iraqi groups who rose up against Saddam Hussein in the 1990s, including those who took place in the failed uprising at the end of the 1991 Gulf War that was encouraged by the United States and by the first President Bush. All of the Afghan Mujahideen groups that fought the Soviet invasion in the 80s with U.S. support. The SPLA, the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, the South Sudanese armed opposition that fought in the Civil War that now is about to have a referendum for independence in the South. Virtually all Ethiopian and Eritrean political parties and movements, past and present, and the list goes on and on. In our report from last year, we have a series of recommendations, very specific recommendations, in addition to the change in statutory language that we believe ultimately is necessary. There's so much that the administration could do on its own without Congress's help. It's already gotten some help from Congress in 2007 with the change in the law. But, among them are stop applying the material support provisions to contributions of goods and services that are insignificant or don't bear any relationship to the furtherance of terrorism activity. We have a section in our report that's called $4 in your lunch. And literally, there are people who have been barred as having given material support for terrorism because they provided money in their pocket and lunch to somebody they may not have even known was a member of a terrorist group. Also looking back, as Michael said, to clear up the backlog, stopped applying this Tier 3 designation to groups that are defunct or have given up violence, and look to what individuals have espoused or done. And we have many, many concrete recommendations that the administration could take up right now, today, that would literally save people's lives and bring families together. Marianne.
Presumably, the president can down to read your letter, but if the current state,
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. Like I said, there are a lot of people in the administration and in the agencies working tirelessly to try to fix this, but there seems to be some kind of a bureaucratic logjam, and I think some of it is by virtue of the way the statute and the exemption authority was written. I mean, you need to have the Justice Department and the State Department and the Homeland Security Department all weigh in on these waivers and these exemptions, and then the authority to delegate exemptions, to issue exemptions has to be delegated. So a lot of it is just the way the statute is written, and a lot of it is just the failure to really kind of come up with a process to do this quickly. It took a long time to come up with a process. We're told now a process is in place, yet it's going to be a while before we see the results of that. And I think, we're just saying that needs to be done more quickly. So as to where it is, it's hard to say. We're just, from the outside, we're saying, just figure out a way to get it done and get it done as quickly as possible.
And in the meantime, let's not deport anybody before they even get a chance to defend themselves. I mean, that's just, it's incredible to me that a person could actually be deported before the process is in place and is actually able to indicate and state why he shouldn't be treated as part of this terrorist group. They ought to freeze any effort to deport somebody until that person has had an opportunity to make their case.
Kevin?
Yeah, and I just want to not let Congress off the hook here. I think they have a responsibility as well to ensure that the law is enforced, and they have oversight responsibility on this. They could be having hearings, they could be writing letters, and we haven't seen as much of that as we'd like to. Also, and I'll go a little bit farther, I think that there is a compelling case to be made to look at some of the material support provisions and see if there should be a statutory fix for situations where someone is in a situation where their lives are dependent on providing this support to someone, and that there be, some sort of exception there. They can put in strong standards of proof. They can tailor it the way they want, but clearly the administration, the previous administration, this administration, are not doing enough to exercise that authority, particularly, and a lot of people are being victimized because of it. And I think Congress has an important role to play, and they're not really playing it as well.
That's absolutely right. I'll ask again if there's anybody on the phone who wants to ask a question. You can press *6 and we'll be able to hear you. Is there somebody behind a pillar?
Yes.
Yes, whoever that is, please ask your question.
Yeah, I got here a little late, so maybe this was addressed. I was wondering, has anyone asked the government if they think these people are terrorists, why they allowed them in the country in the first place? It kind of sounds like the guy the other day who got through airport security with a loaded gun.
Did everyone hear the question? Yeah. So the flip side of this is, if these people are so dangerous, how did they get here in the first place? Shouldn't we be asking that question, Michael?
Well, what happened was they got here in the United States under a tough standard where you had to prove that you were under threat of persecution, and you had to prove that you were loyal to the United States and not a terrorist threat. And then the Real ID and the Patriot Acts got passed, and all of a sudden people who had proven that were told, we don't care how much you prove that you're loyal. We don't care how much you're persecuted. Now, you're an Ethiopian mother who brought food to your son when he was in a jail where they were starving the prisoners. And because the son was affiliated, he never had a weapon himself, but the son was affiliated with a group that was affiliated with a group that used a weapon against the communist regime, the mother is a terrorist. She might have been in the United States, and yet when the law was passed, that was what was done. And there was resistance in the bureaucracy to passing that law that Senator Kyle and Senator Leahy passed. Somebody told me when I talked about the injustice of it, his response was, hey, it's 9/11, baby. That was the kind of response you saw on the part of bureaucracies that just used this as an excuse to shut the doors of the country and gave them an excuse. They leaned on the law just to shut the doors. Then Congress passed the laws, and it just wiped out every determination that people were not terrorists if they were affiliated with a group that was affiliated with a group that might have used weapons 20 years ago. That's the, if you would help, not even shot a gun in the Warsaw Ghetto, but brought food to the people who were shooting guns against the Nazis in the Warsaw Ghetto, the first interpretation was, you're a terrorist. And as Kevin says, I think Congress has a responsibility to make sure that the administration takes what it intended to do seriously. And I think that we have a responsibility to keep the heat on the administration. Let's have tough tests for people before they come into the United States to prove that they'll be persecuted and to prove that they are totally loyal to the United States. But none of this guilt by association nonsense that doesn't allow people to prove these very hard cases on their own behalves.
I mean, I think ironically, if the government really thought that there were terrorists in this group of 4,600 now that are on hold, this issue probably would have been resolved a lot more quickly. The fact is, nobody really thinks this is a group of terrorists, so it's been taking years for the attention to finally get turned towards this and to finally resolve it. So again, I think we wouldn't have seen this kind of long-standing years and years of trying to resolve the problem if anyone really thought we were dealing with a potential threat.
Kevin?
And I'd just like to add that, this affects people who may have never even met a U.S. adjudicator and may have never been interviewed for this program, because internationally it's known now that this is a problem. This is a barrier to some refugee groups getting into the country. And we find situations where refugees may not be even referred for interviews because they assume that this group of refugees is not going to be accepted or considered by the United States because of this material support provision. I'd like to point to Colombians being the group that we're very concerned about, involved in this civil war for years and years, and many cases in which guerrilla groups approach them, ask for support, ask for food, ask for whatever they need, and at the threat of their lives. And because of that, they are kept off any list of saying refer them to the United States for consideration because they're in these situations. And so it goes beyond just those who have been interviewed or we've identified who are on hold, who are already here or waiting overseas. It goes to people who never even have a chance, who need protection to come to this country. It affects beyond our border.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Yes, in the back here.
Do you have any comments on yesterday's Post article on the failure of the passage of the DREAM Act, which means that 800,000 people could be deported? I presume these people are not terrorists. They're just simply illegal immigrants. But what do you have to say about that?
Kevin?
Well, let me start by saying I don't think this panel is about the DREAM Act. I think folks being addressed by the DREAM Act are not the same group of people that we're addressing here in this meeting. So I'm not sure that we ought to be trying to engage more than one topic here.
I would say, shoot me if you will, I'm opposed to the DREAM Act. And I'm pretty hardcore on some of those things because of provisions in it. I know most of the members of this panel disagree with me in that regard, and that's Barrett's point here. There's lots of tough and legitimate debate that we have to have over American immigration policy, and there are tough policy choices that have to be made. But now we have a law, and it needs to be enforced, and the law is reasonable and moderate, and it must be enforced. So that's really what makes this so shameful. That's why you had this letter sent to the president in October, in early October, after a year of trying to get the attention of members of the administration, because this is indefensible. It's inexcusable. It's a bureaucrat saying, hey, if I say no, nothing can happen to me. I don't care about injustice. I don't care about law. I got some excuse that the administration's giving me. I can sit on my hands and I'm covered. That's the sort of thing that all of us find appalling, and it doesn't matter, and it stands in the way of legitimate debate, it seems to me, over what our immigration policy ought to be.
With the cautionary note that we're not going to take on a full discussion of the DREAM Act, where I think there are going to be a
I know I'm
difference of opinion here. I know Kevin and Galen both have a.
Well, I'm going to try to bring the DREAM Act back to the material support issue, but I mean they're parallel in the sense that these are, from our perspective, we're very disappointed that it didn't pass, because we believe that those who would have benefited from it did not have the intent to break the law. They came as children to this country. They were brought by their parents like we all would. Same with the material support thing. Those who are affected by that don't have any intention to harm this country, and they've never had any intention to harm anyone else, frankly. So these are two very vulnerable groups that our country just, to date, in our opinion, has not found the political will to protect. And I think we need to find the political will to protect these vulnerable groups who really are innocent in a lot of ways.
Except I would just say, Kevin, and you have a strong argument, I know, but the people that we're meeting about today are people who are in countries where they can prove that they have a legitimate fear of persecution. These are people we're keeping out and keeping excluded from their family, even though, as Wendy says, they are subject to acute persecution, and we're still keeping them out because of these preposterous constructions of the law and refusal to comply with the law.
I think, yes, we're in vehement agreement about that last point.
Yes, I would just add that these are two cases which are both examples of how our systems do not work. In the case of the DREAM Act, our immigration system is broken, and as a result, innocent people suffer. In the case of the people we're talking about today, our asylum system is broken, and so innocent people are being hurt.
Thank you.
Sorry, I wasn't going to say anything, but I do want to jump in here. We actually, we do support, Highest does support the DREAM Act. Many in the Jewish community do support the DREAM Act. But this is a different issue, and I want to say that this is about the UN Refugee Convention and our obligations towards refugees. We have an international obligation to protect refugees. So as much as we are very sympathetic about the DREAM Act and very supportive of that, this goes back to our international treaty obligations to protect people whose lives are at risk. So I just want to highlight that that's what we're talking about.
And American leadership on that point has been incredibly important throughout the history of the 60 years of the Refugee Convention. The United States having been so involved in crafting the Refugee Convention. Lou Henkin, Professor Lou Henkin, who we lost this year, was a leader in that in that effort to create the Refugee Convention. And the United States, for better or worse, sets the bar on how the rest of the world treats refugees. And this is one of the issues on which we need to lead and do a better job of leading. Do we have any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much for being here. Thank you for joining us through C-SPAN. Thank you to C-SPAN, and thank you to all of these distinguished panelists who've shared their views with us today. Thank you.